On May 9th, 2015, 46-year-old Marty Durham was sitting on his bed in Sand Lake, Michigan, and he couldn't stop laughing because his pet African gray parrot, named Bud, was perched in his cage near the bed, and the bird was just swearing and cussing up a storm. Marty thought it was hysterical. African gray parrots are considered to be some of the very best mimics. They can imitate specific voices, and they can also have vocabularies of close to 1,000 words. Bud's vocabulary clearly included more than a few swear words. As his parrot continued to cuss away, Marty began to hear voices coming from the living room. So, he told Bud he'd see him later. Then Marty placed his hands firmly on the bed, and he slowly pushed himself up to his feet. Immediately, Marty felt a twinge of pain shoot through his legs, but he shook it off. About 20 years earlier, Marty had been in this terrible car accident, and he had suffered very serious injuries. Marty had eventually recovered, but he'd had to battle pain in his legs and back ever since, and that pain had actually only gotten worse over time as Marty got older. And so now, Marty had to actually wear a brace on one of his legs just to help him walk. Marty made his way from the bedroom down a hallway towards the living room. Marty was tall, with short brown hair and a mustache, and he was wearing a t-shirt and denim shorts. Marty stepped into the living room, and he saw his wife, Glenna, was speaking with his adult son, who had stopped by to visit. Marty had 3 children from a previous marriage, and all of them were grown up and out of the house, but they still came by fairly often to spend time with their dad and their stepmom. Marty gave his son a hug, and then he sat down on the couch next to Glenna. The living room was almost like a shrine to Marty's favorite pastime, which was hunting. There were buckheads mounted on the wall as trophies, and the brown leather couch was draped with all these blankets that had images of deer on them. Marty's son asked how Bud the parrot was doing, and Marty just started laughing again. And then he told his son about how Bud was just ranting in the bedroom. Marty and his ex-wife, Christina, had had Bud since the kids were young, so Marty's son had grown up with this bird. After chatting for a bit, Marty asked his son and his wife if they wanted to go outside, and they said yes. So, Glenna stood up, and she helped Marty get to his feet. Glenna, like Marty, was 46 years old, and she had long brown hair, and she wore glasses. Glenna unlocked the back door, and then the 3 of them stepped out onto the new wooden deck that Marty and Glenna had just put in. It was an absolutely perfect day, about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Marty breathed in the fresh air, and he felt an utter sense of calm come over him. Being outside was like freedom to Marty. There was just nothing like it as far as he was concerned. That was actually a huge reason why he had bought the house where he and Glenna now lived. Years after Marty's terrible car accident, he had received some insurance money from the crash, and he had used that money to help him buy his blue wooden house in a very secluded area in the small rural town of Sand Lake. Marty loved the house itself, but it was actually the land that the house sat on that made him happier than almost anything else. From the deck, Marty looked out across the huge backyard at all the surrounding woods, and he couldn't help but think about his next hunting trip. If it were up to him, he'd go hunting or fishing every single day. But he knew he had to take it easy sometimes to give his legs a rest. Marty, Glenna, and Marty's son spent a good part of the day just sitting outside on the deck and talking. Then, at some point, Marty's son said he needed to get home. So, Marty stood up, and he gave his son another hug, and then told him he'd see him soon. Then Marty's son said bye and left the deck and walked around the house towards the front, where his car was. Marty and Glenna just stayed out back on the deck. Hours later, Marty and Glenna were still outside, and they watched the sky turn gold and red as the sun began to set. Marty knew there was no such thing as a perfect life, and he had been through enough to know that everything could change in an instant. But there were times, like right now, when he just couldn't imagine being in a better place than he was. He had 3 kids that he loved dearly, and he was a grandfather with another grandchild on the way. He had this amazing house on this great land, and he was married to someone who he genuinely loved, Glenna. Marty and Glenna had actually first met when they were teenagers, and they had been attracted to each other right away. They began dating, and for a while, they spent as much time together as they could. Both Marty and Glenna had had a shared love of nature, So they were always out and about, walking around in the forest and going on long walks together. They also spent a lot of time together hanging out with friends in town. But then, to the shock of a lot of their friends, Marty and Glenna had broken up and gone their separate ways. Not long after they had broken up, they both got married to other people. Marty married Christina, his first wife, and they had 3 kids together and their pet parrot, Bud. For years, they had a pretty happy life together. Glenna had gotten married and had kids of her own too. After Marty's car accident, Christina, his first wife, helped him a lot during his recovery. But their relationship started to become strained over time, and they ended up getting divorced about 5 years after Marty's wreck. Then Marty had moved out, bought the blue wooden house on the amazing land, and continued to raise his kids. It turned out that Glenna had also gotten a divorce, and Marty and Glenna, who had almost been inseparable as teenagers, ultimately reconnected and rekindled their relationship. Glenna had moved back in with Marty back in 2001, and a few years later, they had gotten married. Some of their friends thought it seemed like no time had passed at all, like somehow Marty and Glenna were the exact same together as they had been when they were kids. They could still just sit down and talk for hours at a time and not get bored, and they still loved spending loads of time outdoors together. On the backyard deck, Marty and Glenna watched the last rays of sun disappear, and then went inside the house. Glenna went to the kitchen to get dinner ready, and Marty headed to the bedroom. On the way to the bedroom, he checked the front door to make sure it was locked. Marty had always been someone who was very cautious, and so he liked to keep all the doors locked and dead-bolted, even when he and Glenna were home during the day. Some of that precaution was really just because that was Marty's nature, but it was also because Marty knew he kept several hunting weapons and handguns in the house. So, if someone did come into the home, he knew things could turn violent very quickly. And even though they did live in a pretty secluded area, there was a road not too far from them, so people did pass by them, and Marty just didn't want to take any chances. Marty walked into his bedroom, and he saw Bud the parrot bobbing back and forth on his perch. Then Marty stepped into the bathroom, and he took a prescription pain pill out of a bottle on the counter, and he washed the pill down with water from the sink. Marty took a deep breath, went back into the bedroom, and sat down on the bed. Marty didn't usually take as many pain pills as were prescribed to him for the day, but sometimes in the evening, his leg pain got a lot worse, and the pills really helped. But even with the big inconvenience of chronic pain and some of the other issues his car accident had caused over the years, Marty still tried hard not to dwell on the past. As he sat there waiting for his pain meds to kick in, he smiled because he was thankful for what he had: a great family, a house he loved, and a foul-mouthed talking bird who could always make him laugh. On the evening of May 11th, 2015, so 2 days after Marty's son had come to visit, the smell of Italian food wafted through Marty and Glenna's house. Marty walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. Then Glenna came over and put down a plate of spaghetti and garlic bread in front of him. Then she also put another plate down for herself, and she sat down across from Marty. As they ate dinner, Marty talked about wanting to plan a trip with some friends to go hunting wild boar and ram. Those types of hunting trips were far more complicated to coordinate than deer hunting trips in this area, and the pain in Marty's legs. Often, it made it very difficult for him to drive, which might make the trip even more complicated. Still, Marty was excited to try to put the trip together, and Glenna didn't have any objections. She often drove Marty to his doctor's appointments or other important places he had to go, and so they could figure something out for the hunting trip if they needed to. After dinner, Glenna picked up the plates and left them on the counter in the kitchen. Then Marty and Glenna went to the living room and watched television for a couple of hours. Finally, just after midnight, Marty was tired, so he said goodnight to Glenna. He got up, and he went to their bedroom. Glenna told him she was going to stay up a bit longer and look at her phone. Once he was in the bedroom, Marty undressed and got into bed. He then said goodnight to Bud, the parrot, then flipped off the light and went to sleep. But hours later, at about 5 a.m., Marty suddenly woke up feeling really startled. He heard his closet door open, and then he heard shouting. Then Bud, the parrot, began squawking from his perch, and Marty was just so confused. He had no idea what was going on. But then Marty's eyes focused in the low light, and he saw there was someone standing in his bedroom just a few feet away. And so, Marty shouted at this person in the room, and the bird squawked even louder. Over 24 hours later, so on May 13th, Marty and Glenna's neighbor watched smoke rising into the air not far from her house. Then the neighbor heard the screams of sirens and saw a fire truck barreling down her road. The neighbor was very worried about Marty and Glenna. She had texted both of them several times the day before, but neither of them had responded, and this just was not like them. The neighbor and Marty and Glenna were all very good friends, and they talked and texted all the time, and they were always very quick to get back to each other. The neighbor had also gone by Marty and Glenna's house the day before, but the couple hadn't been home. And so, now that this neighbor is seeing fire trucks come bombing down her road, and she's seeing smoke in the air, naturally, she worried that the fire might be coming from Marty and Glenna's house. And so, the neighbor just ran outside and began running down the street towards Marty and Glenna's house. As she ran down the road, she saw the fire trucks up ahead coming to a stop, and the firefighters jumping down off the truck to get the hoses ready to put out the fire. But as the neighbor went down the road, she realized that it was actually a small fire that was not on Marty and Glenna's property. Their house was not on fire, and so the neighbor was totally relieved. But since the neighbor was already outside, they decided they would just go to Marty and Glenna's house to see if maybe they were home then. But when the neighbor crossed Marty and Glenna's huge front yard and arrived on their front porch and knocked on the door, there was no answer. The neighbor thought about leaving, but she just couldn't shake this feeling that something was wrong with Marty and Glenna. So the neighbor just reached down and grabbed the doorknob and tried to turn it. And shockingly, the doorknob turned because the door was unlocked. And this really frightened the neighbor. She knew how much Marty liked to keep all the doors locked and deadbolted basically all the time. The neighbor cautiously opened up the door and then stepped inside the house and then began calling out to Marty and Glenna, but the house was silent. So, the neighbor turned the corner and walked into the living room. And when she did, it was like her heart skipped a beat because the place was a total wreck. A lamp had been tipped over and knocked off a table, and there were papers and trash scattered all across the floor. Then the neighbor heard the parrot Bud begin to squawk in Marty and Glenna's bedroom. So, the neighbor walked down the hallway to the bedroom, and they stepped inside. And Bud, who was in the back cage, squawked louder and louder. And the neighbor just kind of looked around the bedroom, and at first, it just looked like a normal bedroom, except for the fact that all the blankets from the bed were basically piled on the ground right in front of the door. So, the neighbor stepped over those blankets and began walking towards the back of the bedroom to see what was next to the bed. And when she saw what was on the ground next to the bed, the neighbor just froze. Because there, next to the bed on the ground, was Marty in his underwear, with his face and chest covered in blood. The neighbor was totally shocked, and they turned to run out of the room. But as soon as she turned, she looked down and realized, now from her vantage point, she could see that actually Glenna was inside of those blankets that she had stepped over when she first came in. And now the neighbor was seeing Glenna's face, and Glenna's skin was pale, and her hair was matted down with blood. And the neighbor just screamed and jumped over Glenna and ran out of that house, and then screamed for all the firefighters who were right nearby, putting out that small fire. And one of the firefighters saw the neighbor and rushed over to her. And after she explained what she just found in her friend's house, the firefighter motioned for 2 of the first responders. And then the 3 of them ran into Marty and Glenna's house. And then, as soon as they walked into the bedroom and actually saw Marty and Glenna on the ground, the first responders knew they were dealing with a crime scene. And so, one of the firefighters called police dispatch, and he said they had just found 2 dead bodies, and they needed police on the scene as soon as possible. About 2 hours later, at around 5:30 p.m., Sergeant Gary Wilson of the Michigan State Police arrived in front of Marty and Glenna's house. Sergeant Wilson saw an ambulance and a fire truck nearby, and there were multiple firefighters, paramedics, and state troopers standing outside the house. Sergeant Wilson got out of his car and walked over to one of the firefighters. The firefighter explained that they had to put out a small fire in the area. But then this woman had come running out of Marty and Glenna's house, screaming for help. The firefighter said, "You know, once they had seen what was inside of the house, members of the fire department and other first responders were instructed to stay outside until police arrived, because it was believed the house was now a crime scene." Now, Sergeant Wilson had been told all of this already by police dispatch. He also had been told that he was very likely responding to a double suicide. But when Wilson approached the house, one of the state troopers went over to meet him, and that trooper believed there was a strong chance they were actually dealing with a double homicide, not double suicide. Wilson followed the trooper inside the house to the bedroom, and when Wilson saw Marty on the floor, he was also pretty sure the man had not killed himself. Marty had multiple gunshot wounds, and there was no weapon nearby. Then Wilson stepped over to the pile of blankets on the floor to get a better look at Glenna's body. But when he crouched down on one knee and leaned in closer to her, he heard a loud gasp. Glenna's eyes opened, and then she screamed. Wilson stood and stumbled back a few steps. He was in shock, but he quickly called for a paramedic and kept shouting over and over again that she's alive. "She's alive, guys, get in here!" Paramedics rushed into the bedroom and began working to get Glenna oxygen. Then they put her on a stretcher, wheeled her outside, and got her into the ambulance. As the ambulance sped away to the hospital, Wilson stood in Glenna and Marty's bedroom, trying to recover from the shock of what had just happened. And then, once he'd caught his breath and calmed down, Sergeant Wilson called in that one of the victims, who everybody thought was dead, was actually alive. Also, Wilson said he believed they were not dealing with a suicide, but a murder, and so he needed a forensics team. Not long after Glenna woke up in the bedroom, a state forensics team arrived at the property and began doing a thorough sweep. In the bedroom, not far from Marty's body, they found several bullet casings. They also found a key to Marty's gun safe on the floor, and they located the safe in the closet. So Wilson's first thought was that someone who knew that Marty kept guns in a safe had taken the key, gotten a weapon out of the safe, and then, using that weapon, they had killed Marty and attempted to kill Glenna. And the idea that the killer was someone the couple knew made sense because there was no sign of forced entry in their house. Now, Marty and Glenna's neighbor had found the front door unlocked, so it was possible that maybe Marty or Glenna had unknowingly welcomed the killer into their home. But the forensics team also found something very strange in the bedroom Marty had died, while clutching a patch of hair in his right hand. So they would need to run DNA tests to see if the hair matched Marty's or if it belonged to someone else, like maybe his killer. Sergeant Wilson heard someone calling to him from the living room, so he stepped out of the bedroom and headed that way. When he got there, he saw a forensics officer on the ground, bagging a piece of evidence. The officer had found a .22 caliber Ruger revolver underneath one of the living room chairs. Sergeant Wilson knew they would have to wait for ballistics testing to see if this revolver really was the murder weapon, but Wilson already had a strong feeling that, very likely, this was the murder weapon. And he was almost positive that that gun must have come out of Marty's safe. After several hours in the house, Wilson felt like he still had a lot of questions to answer. So he called the hospital, in hopes that Glenna was now in stable condition and able to talk to him about who had shot her and her husband. But doctors would tell him that Glenna, unfortunately, was still very much recovering from her wound and not really in a good position to talk to him, at least not yet. So, Sergeant Wilson decided if he couldn't talk to Marty's wife, then he would just start his investigation with other members of Marty's family, his kids. On May 14th, so a day after Marty's body had been discovered, Marty's sons and his daughter climbed under the crime scene tape outside of Marty's house and approached the front door. They all stood at the door, still in total shock. How could this place, that had made them so happy over the years, now be just a violent crime scene? It just didn't make sense to them. The siblings entered the house. They were there to pick up Bud the parrot. They could bring him back to their mother, Marty's ex-wife Christina. But before they actually made it to the bedroom to grab Bud, they were all stunned by the mess in the living room. Their dad and their stepmother had always kept the house very neat and tidy, so it didn't even look like the same place. Then something caught their attention. A large manila envelope was on the living room floor amongst the mess. And so one of Marty's sons crouched down and opened the envelope and looked inside. He showed the contents to his brother and sister, and they all agreed this was something they should hold on to. Then they went to the bedroom to get Bud the parrot. Soon after they had left, the siblings brought Bud to their mother's house. Then they decided to show the police the manila envelope they had found. Later that day, after Marty's children had contacted the police, they were brought into the local station to be interviewed. Sergeant Wilson had already planned to begin his investigation with Marty's kids, but now that they had this manila envelope, he was so eager to speak with them. Wilson knew there was a good chance that he was simply dealing with 3 grief-stricken young people who had just lost their father. But he still could not eliminate any of Marty's kids as potential suspects, at least not yet. So Wilson first led Marty's oldest son, Justin, into a small office at the station. Wilson wanted to meet with each of Marty's kids separately. He believed that if one of the kids had information about the case, they were more likely to share it if each of them was on their own in the office. Wilson told Justin they were not accusing him of anything. They just wanted to talk to him to see if he had any information that could help with their investigation. And Justin was very calm and seemed eager to cooperate. Wilson asked Justin if he knew about any enemies his father might have, or if his dad had recently had a falling out with any of his friends. Justin said he couldn't think of anyone. He said his dad was really close with his neighbors and his hunting buddies, and they all seemed to get along really well. But then Justin got a look on his face, like he just remembered something. He looked up at Wilson and told him that there were a bunch of people who knew his father had a big supply of prescription pain medication inside of his house. When Wilson heard this, he immediately sat back in his chair and just thought for a second. At the time, the opioid epidemic in the United States was near its height. Prescription painkillers like the ones Marty took were in very high demand, and addicts had been known to commit terrible crimes to get a hold of these drugs. So Sergeant Wilson started to wonder if someone who knew Marty had killed him and attempted to kill his wife simply to get a hold of Marty's pills. After they talked a bit longer, Wilson thanked Justin for his cooperation and told him police would be in touch if they needed anything else. Later that day, Wilson and other investigators met with Marty's 2 other kids, and their version of events surrounding their visit to their dad and stepmother's house and the manila envelope they found in the living room were all basically the same. So in the following days, investigators met with other people who were close to Marty to see if they had any information they might be able to add. And one of the people investigators spoke to said she knew that Marty's guns were not the only things that he and Glenna kept locked up in their safe. They also kept a couple of $1,000 in cash locked up. But, as Sergeant Wilson knew, no cash had been found inside of that safe. And so, suddenly, the information about this missing money and the information Marty's son had given about Marty's pills started to paint a picture of what happened for investigators. And so now, their theory was that someone Marty and Glenna knew had possibly come to their house with the intention of robbing them of their cash and their prescription drugs. So Wilson wanted to meet with anyone who had known about the safe in the couple's house to see if he could track down the missing money and Marty and Glenna's attacker. It had only been about a week since the attack, but Sergeant Wilson and the rest of his team were already getting frustrated. They felt like they had all these puzzle pieces right in front of them, but none of the pieces seemed to connect. There was the missing money from the safe. There was that manila envelope that Marty's kids had found in the living room. And there was the potential that somebody had wanted to steal Marty's prescription pain pills. But as investigators spoke to just about anybody who had any connection to Marty and Glenna, they couldn't find any evidence that sort of pointed to a particular person, a primary suspect. And they still had no leads on the missing money. Wilson had desperately hoped that Glenna would be able to provide the missing pieces that would make the puzzle kind of come together. But she was recovering in the hospital. And so, for now, an interview was still not possible. But when the investigation began to look like it was genuinely running into a dead end and might go cold, Michigan State Trooper Barry Wolf took a phone call at his desk. Wolf, like other members of the investigative team, had been worried about the lack of progress they were making. But as he listened to this caller on the other line, he wasn't sure if he was getting the tip police had been hoping for, or if he was about to be sent on an insane wild goose chase. The caller was a woman who was named Fran Marias. She was the wife of one of Marty's cousins, and she was a the wife of one of Marty's cousins, and she was a self-proclaimed psychic. On the phone, Fran told Officer Wolf that she had received important information about Marty's murder during a psychic reading, and she'd like to share this information with the police. And so, Wolf told Fran he'd be right over to see her. Then Officer Wolf told Sergeant Wilson about this call. Neither of the men really believed in psychic phenomena, but a person saying they had potentially important information about this case, especially someone who had a family connection to the victim, couldn't be ignored. So, after speaking to Wilson, Wolf left the building, got into his cruiser, and went to meet Fran at her house to see what her supposed visions had shown her. When Wolf arrived, he found Fran sitting on her back porch, and she motioned for him to join her. Wolf introduced himself, thanked Fran for contacting him, and then took a seat next to her. Fran spoke in a low but very confident voice. She knew some people thought she was crazy or just making things up, but she trusted her psychic gifts, and she felt like the police should trust them too. Fran reached down beside her and took a small notebook out of a folder. She told Wolf that she had written down information she'd received during a recent psychic vision. Then she flipped open the notebook and began reading. Fran told Wolf that it was important for police to look under the couch or the love seat in Marty and Glenna's living room. Then Fran looked up and stared directly into Wolf's eyes and told him that Marty's right hand was also going to be very important to the investigation. When she said this, Wolf sat back in his chair and just stared at Fran in disbelief. Investigators had found that Ruger underneath the chair in the living room. Sure, that wasn't the same as a couch or love seat, but it was pretty close. Also, Wolf was shocked to hear Fran mention Marty's right hand, because Marty had been found clutching that patch of hair in his right hand. But Wolf's first thought was not that this woman was actually psychic. It was, instead, that she clearly had information about a crime scene that only somebody who had been there would know about. And so, Wolf did not want to alarm Fran in any way that he could be onto her. Instead, he just smiled and told her that this was very interesting. Then he asked her where she had been at the time Marty was murdered, and Fran told him that she had been with her daughter. After that, Wolf thanked Fran again for getting in touch with him, and then he walked off her porch and went back to his car. Once he was inside and turned it back on, he gunned the engine and sped back to the station to tell the rest of the investigative team about this weird meeting. And once he did tell them about this weird meeting, the Michigan State Police had to either accept that Fran really got this information from a psychic reading she'd done, or they would have to add a local psychic to their list of suspects. Sergeant Wilson told investigators to follow up on Fran's alibi, and he could barely believe the turn this investigation was taking. But it wouldn't be long before Wilson realized having a psychic involved was not remotely the weirdest thing about this case. In October of 2015, so almost 5 months after the attack that left Marty dead, Sergeant Wilson finally got the call he'd been waiting for. Glenna had been released from the hospital, and she was now able to speak with police. Investigators had spent the last few months searching for that lost money and looking into the psychic's background, and they had come up empty. They had potential suspects, but none of them seemed all that viable. But now, Wilson would be able to talk to someone who was literally there when the attack happened, Glenna, and he hoped she'd be able to clear up a lot of the questions that he and his team still had. Glenna met with Wilson at the police station, and after they made it into the interview room, Wilson asked her, "What do you remember about the day that you and your husband were attacked?" Immediately when Glenna began to talk, Wilson knew he was not going to get the clear-cut evidence he had been hoping for. Glenna told him she'd been struggling with her memory ever since she arrived at the hospital. She said she could barely remember anything about the day of the shooting or even the days leading up to it. Wilson knew Glenna was dealing with a serious head injury, so her memory loss did not come as much of a surprise. But he still believed Glenna was going to be the key to figuring out who killed Marty. So Wilson began talking to Glenna about pieces of evidence that had been found at the scene, hoping maybe something would spark her memory. But by the end of the interview, Glenna had not remembered anything that could point the investigation in any one direction. And so, Wilson began to feel lost again. As the weeks and months passed, investigators continued to pursue all of their potential leads, but they still had no clear killer. And Marty's family was now also starting to become very frustrated. They wanted answers, and they wanted some kind of closure. But even as the 1-year anniversary of Marty's murder approached, the case was still open, and people close to Marty had no idea if it would ever be closed. In May of 2016, so a year after Marty was killed, a news reporter for a Grand Rapids, Michigan television station stared at a video playing on his computer screen. His eyes were wide, and his mouth was hanging open. This guy couldn't believe what he was watching. On the video, Marty's pet parrot Bud was clinging to the side of his cage, and he was shouting in Marty's voice. Then the parrot's voice would completely change, and he would speak in somebody else's voice who was not shouting. And then the parrot would shift back into Marty's voice, and he would keep on shouting. The reporter was watching Bud mimic an argument the bird clearly had heard between Marty and somebody else. And the reporter was almost certain the other voice that Bud was mimicking belonged to Marty's killer, and that this argument must have taken place right before the murder, because at one point in the video, Bud mimicked Marty's voice by yelling, "Don't, shoot!" The reporter watched the entire video, and then when it was done, he watched it again. And afterwards, he knew it had to be aired. The news station contacted Marty's first wife, Christina, who had gotten Bud back after Marty was killed. Christina told producers at the station that she was the one who had shot that video about a month after Marty's murder. But she had only told people who were close to her about it. She had never intended for it to make the news. Marty's parents had done a follow-up interview with a local television station, and during that interview, the video of Bud the parrot screaming, "Don't shoot," had come up. Eventually, that video of Bud was shown to the local news crew, and then, somehow, the video made its way to the much larger television station in Grand Rapids. Not long after that, the Grand Rapids television station played Bud's video on the news, and soon, the story got picked up all over the world. Suddenly, Bud the parrot seemed like a hero. He was like a key witness to an unsolved murder, and everyone believed he was going to be the key to solving the case. The worldwide attention Bud's video brought to Marty's murder might have put added pressure on the investigative team, but police insisted that the parrot video did not change the way they were pursuing the case. Then, in June, a month after Bud's video appeared on television, investigators announced they had actually made an arrest in Marty's murder case. Police maintained that Bud the parrot's supposed eyewitness account of the murder had nothing to do with the arrest. It just so happened that, at this time, they had finally figured out who took the money from Marty's safe. And soon after that, they had discovered a piece of evidence that broke the case wide open and led them to Marty's killing. Based on evidence found at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened in the early morning hours of May 12, 2015, when someone killed Marty Durham in his bedroom. At 5 a.m. on May 12, 2015, the glow from the killer's phone lit their face as they walked down the hallway inside of Marty and Glenna's house. The killer was breathing heavily, and they were scared and nervous, but they managed to walk quietly towards the bedroom. Once they got there, the killer opened the bedroom door and stepped inside. The low light from the killer's phone provided enough illumination that the killer could see the African gray parrot in its cage. The killer quickly walked across the room to the closet. Then they opened it up and used their phone light to locate the key to the large gun safe that was inside. Once they had the key, the killer held their breath and unlocked the safe. Tucked away amongst several hunting rifles, they found a loaded .22 caliber Ruger revolver. The killer grabbed the gun and stared at it in their hand for a second. Then they turned, stepped out of the closet, approached the bed, and just started yelling. Immediately, Marty, who was in bed, sat up, totally startled, and the noise caused Bud the parrot to start squawking, which only added to the confusion. Marty kind of shook himself awake, and he saw the killer just standing there. Still not sure what was happening, Marty just began screaming too. So Marty, the parrot, and the killer are all yelling. But then, in the light from the killer's phone and the glow from the moon that was coming in through the window, Marty noticed the killer had a gun by their side. So Marty pulled himself up and out of bed, and right away, he very likely felt that pain shooting through his legs and back. At the same time, Bud keeps squawking from his cage, and the killer kept shouting at Marty. I mean, It was absolute chaos, but Marty was still hopeful he could maybe get out of there. So Marty raised up his hands in a defensive position and tried to walk past the killer. The killer raised the gun and aimed it right at Marty's chest, and Marty screamed, "Don't underscore shoot!" But the killer fired. They fired 3 shots in rapid succession, hitting Marty in the chest again and again and again. Then the killer fired 2 more times, and those bullets struck Marty's forearm and his back. As he fell, Marty collapsed on the floor, dead. The killer just stood there, staring down at Marty's body. Then the killer took a deep breath, calmly walked out of the bedroom, and made their way towards the front door. They unlocked it. Then the killer made their way to the living room, and they tipped a lamp off an end table onto the floor. Then they emptied a desk, drawer, and some shelves, and made a total mess of the place. Then the killer just kind of stood there, scanning around their house, looking at what they had just done. So far, their plan had gone exactly the way they hoped, but the hardest part was yet to come. Finally, the killer took several deep breaths, doing their best to stay calm and steady. Then they raised their gun and placed the barrel behind their right ear, and they pulled the trigger. Immediately, blood began pouring out of the wound, and the room began to spin, but the killer kept their balance long enough to toss the gun under a nearby living room chair. Then the killer stumbled back into the bedroom and fell down onto the ground. Before they passed out, they grabbed a huge pile of blankets nearby and pulled them up and over their head. It would turn out Glenna had murdered Marty and then, obviously, shot herself. But around the year anniversary of Marty's death, it turned out that Marty and Glenna's marriage had not been as perfect as some of their friends believed. Over the years, Glenna had racked up a huge amount of debt. She had lost about $750,000 gambling at nearby casinos, and as a result, she had stopped making mortgage payments on their house. But Marty never knew any of that. Not long before the murder, Glenna had learned that the house that Marty loved so much was now going into foreclosure, and so, soon, he would learn the truth, and they would both be forced out. Early on in the investigation, police had actually learned about the pending foreclosure, and they discovered Glenna's gambling habit. So they started to think that Glenna had killed Marty and then tried to kill herself, seeing a murder-suicide as her only way out. This murder-suicide theory was only bolstered when police looked inside of that manila envelope that Marty's kids had found when they went to Marty's house to get Bud. The manila envelope contained several letters that Glenna had written to her kids and to her ex-husband. In the letters, Glenna expressed how sorry she was and asked them to please take care of each other. Police believe those letters sounded like suicide notes. But in a case involving a psychic and a talking bird, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Because if it was a murder-suicide, why had thousands of dollars been taken from the safe? Why was the house completely wrecked? And why had the gun been hidden in the living room when Marty and Glenna were found in their bedroom? Those were questions investigators had to answer if they were ever going to determine what had really happened. Finally, investigators discovered who had taken the money from the safe, because Marty's kids had come forward and admitted they took the cash when they went to collect Bud the parrot. Even though Marty's kids had taken the money, police still didn't consider them primary suspects. Instead, they thought Marty's kids were just young and foolish and had made a very bad decision. So, with the money from the safe now accounted for, investigators were able to rule it out as a motive for the murder. And the psychic's alibi eventually checked out, so the investigators crossed her off of their suspect list. But they would be left wondering how she seemed to know undisclosed details about the crime scene. DNA tests conducted on the hair found inside of Marty's hand also did not end up helping investigators. So, all of this brought Sergeant Wilson and his team back to the possibility of a murder and failed suicide attempt committed by Glenna. But of course, there were still unanswered questions. It wasn't like they had found the gun in Glenna's hand. Then, in early summer of 2016, the media and the public latched onto that viral video of Bud the parrot saying, "Don't underscore shoot," and many claimed the other voice that Bud was speaking in sounded an awful lot like Glenna. But police continued to rely on more common investigative techniques to determine if Glenna was, in fact, the killer. They dug deep into Glenna's phone records and internet history, And when they had a clear picture of Glenna's online activity, they got the break in the case they had been looking for. It turned out that hours before Marty's murder, Glenna had been online researching various aspects of the .22 caliber Ruger revolver, the type of gun used to kill Marty. And some investigators believed Glenna had learned a lot more than just how to fire or reload the weapon. They thought she had found a way to shoot herself that would allow her to live and enable her to keep functioning even after she had pulled the trigger. In fact, a neurosurgeon would testify in court that the wounds found behind Glenna's ear were non-lethal, and that those wounds would not necessarily result in a loss of consciousness. This meant that Glenna could have shot herself in the head in the living room, and then still manage to hide the gun, get back to the bedroom, and get into position under the blankets, all before she was found. So, as bizarre as this case had seemed at times, investigators believed they had solved the most important part of the puzzle, that Glenna had murdered Marty. Some people close to the case would continue to believe that the crime was still the result of Glenna's failed murder-suicide plan, meaning Glenna really did intend to end her life, but just didn't, because where she shot herself was non-lethal. Even though Glenna denied the letters she had written to her family were suicide notes, others believed there were even darker motives at play, and that Glenna murdered Marty, then tried to make it look like a robbery, and then also tried to make herself look like a victim too. So they didn't believe suicide was ever part of Glenna's plan, that she definitely did try to intentionally shoot the part of her head that wouldn't kill her. This was all a big con. But it's not clear what Glenna's motives were for doing this. Like, what did she stand to gain by killing her husband and framing this whole thing? It just didn't make any sense. But regardless of what the actual reason was for why Glenna did what she did, by the summer of 2016, police had enough evidence to arrest her. Glenna was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. By 2019, Bud the parrot had found a new home with Christina, Marty's first wife, where he lived alongside another African gray parrot named Oli. According to Christina, the two parrots had grown very close and were now best friends. On Saturday, the 14th of November, 1998, 35-year-old Sarah Roos and her best friend Laura scanned the racks at a local clothing store in Howard County, Maryland. Sarah wasn't really looking to buy any new clothes, but she was desperate to distract herself from the horrible day she was having, and she hoped shopping might help with that. This was one of the weekends that her estranged husband, Lorenzo, had custody of their 1-year-old son, and Sarah hated every minute she was apart from her baby. Sarah and her husband were in the middle of a heated divorce and custody battle, and if she had her way, Lorenzo would actually never see their son again. Just then, Laura pointed out a shirt that she thought Sarah might actually like. It would look great with Sarah's red hair, she said. Sarah forced a smile, but deep down she knew that this retail therapy was not having the desired effect. Sarah continued to walk around the store, but she just couldn't shake herself out of her bad mood. And this frustrated her because she'd always prided herself on being this really upbeat, positive person. In fact, up until about a year ago, Sarah's life had seemed almost perfect. She worked as a statistician for the National Security Agency, or NSA for short, helping solve a range of information security issues for multiple federal agencies. Sarah had always had a gift for mathematics, and so using her talent to help her country was like a dream job for her. Also, at the time, she had begun writing her first novel, a murder mystery, about a brilliant statistician who solves crimes, and she and her husband, Lorenzo, had bought this beautiful house in a suburban neighborhood that looked like something out of a painting. The streets were lined with manicured lawns and white picket fences, and perhaps most importantly for Sarah, she had become a mother. But soon after her baby was born, things at home had begun to fall apart. Lorenzo didn't seem to want anything to do with helping raise the child, so Sarah quickly felt like she was juggling this important government job with taking care of a newborn baby all on her own. Also, Sarah's family lived about 1,000 miles away in Alabama, so they weren't able to help. Luckily though, her mother-in-law, Lorenzo's mom, had pitched in and began babysitting whenever she could, and also helping Sarah with cooking and cleaning. But Sarah's mother-in-law worked full-time at a retirement home, so there was only so much she could do. And no matter how much Sarah begged Lorenzo for his help, he basically just refused. After almost a year of this, Sarah just couldn't take it anymore, so she filed for divorce. However, as soon as she did that, Lorenzo suddenly began acting like he wanted to be with their child all the time, and so he made the divorce and custody proceedings very difficult for Sarah. Back in the store, Sarah's friend Laura asked her if there was anything Sarah wanted to try on. Sarah thanked Laura for going out with her and trying to help her get her mind off of things, but at this point, she said she just wanted to go home. Laura said she totally understood, and the two friends said goodbye and headed to their cars in the parking lot. A little later that night, Sarah opened up a notebook and her laptop on a coffee table in her family room and began working on her mystery novel. Then, at around 8:45 p.m., as she was still hard at work, she suddenly heard something and looked up, startled. She held her breath, trying to be as quiet as possible, but she didn't hear anything else. Still feeling unsettled, she got up, walked down the hallway to her bedroom, and then crouched down by her bed. And there on the floor, she saw the large metal skillet, exactly where she kept it every night. Living by herself with her baby made her nervous, so the skillet let her feel like she had a weapon close by when she went to bed. But as Sarah stayed there, crouched down by her bed for a second, she didn't hear any more noise anywhere in the house, and so she shook off her nerves and decided to leave the skillet behind. She told herself she was just being paranoid, and so Sarah stood back up, walked down the hallway, and sat down in the family room, getting ready to dive back into her mystery novel. However, just moments later, she heard the sound of shattering glass. At 7:45 p.m. on the following night, Sarah's friend Laura got home after being out for most of the day. She walked into her kitchen and tossed her keys on the counter, and she noticed the light on her answering machine was blinking. And so, Laura picked up her phone, hit a button to play back the message, and the automated voice on the machine told her that this message had come in the previous night at 8:56 p.m. Laura figured she must have missed the call the night before and just not noticed she had this voicemail before she went out earlier. The voicemail began to play, and at first, all Laura heard was static, and she thought maybe somebody had dialed accidentally and not left a message. But suddenly, she heard heavy breathing and then screaming and crying, and then the message ended. Then the automated voice gave Laura the option to dial the number of that caller back. Laura just stood there for a second, completely freaked out by what she had just heard. She snapped out of it and hit that button to automatically return the call, and when she did, it went straight to Sarah's voicemail. Laura's hands started shaking now that she knew it was Sarah who had left this message. It was like the urgency went through the roof. And so she hung up and tried calling her friend right back, hoping maybe this time Sarah would pick up. But again, it just rung and went voicemail. And so Laura hung up and immediately dialed 911-1. A few minutes later, a Howard County police officer pulled up in front of Sarah's house. He'd been out on patrol nearby when he got the call to do a wellness check at this address. The officer got out of his car and walked towards the front door. It was dark out, but there were lights on. Inside the house, and also out in front of the house. However, before the officer even got to the front door, he froze. He saw that one of the front windows of the house had been smashed in, and there was glass laying all over the ground under the windowsill. His first thought was that he had just stumbled upon a robbery, and so the officer quickly went to the front door and knocked, but he barely waited before trying the doorknob. When he saw it was locked, the officer quickly used a special tool to unlock it, and then he opened up the door. The officer stepped inside the house and slowly began walking around, calling out to see if anybody was home, and keeping his hand hovering above his weapon. For all he knew, the robber might still be in the house and could be armed. The officer eventually made his way into the brightly lit family room, and when he did, he looked down at the floor. As soon as he saw what was there, he turned and ran out of the house. He got to his cruiser, fumbled for his radio, and called for backup. It was close to 9 p.m. That night, when Detective Nate Reddick of the Howard County Police stepped out of his car and approached the officer who had first arrived on the scene. By now, this quiet neighborhood had come to life. Detective Reddig saw neighbors standing on their porches, staring at all the police and first responders swarming outside of Sarah's house. Reddig spoke to the responding officer who had come to the house for a wellness check. He was a young officer who now looked completely shaken by what he had seen inside of the house. Luckily, Reddig, who was more senior than this young officer, had a very fatherly demeanor about him. He was tall and still, and always appeared to be in total control. He spoke in a calm voice with the Baltimore accent, and he was able to get the young officer to calm down and also give him a detailed account of what he had seen inside of the house that had shaken him. After that, Reddig told the young officer to just stay outside, and then Reddig put on his gloves and walked to the front door. Once inside, Reddig went straight to the family room, and when he looked down at what was on the ground, it shocked him too. He just walked into one of the goriest crime scenes he'd ever witnessed in his many years as a homicide detective. A woman, who looked like she was in her 30s, was covered in blood, and there was blood spatter all over the walls and the floor. But that wasn't all. The woman had clearly been hacked and stabbed at with a blade so violently and so many times that her head had nearly been decapitated, and her hands were barely connected to her wrists. Reddig's first thought was that this had to have been a rage-filled overkill. I mean, several of the wounds he was looking at that had been inflicted on this woman individually should have been enough to kill her, but she had several of those fatal-seeming wounds. Also, a scene this brutal typically meant investigators were dealing with a crime of passion. Detective Reddig saw a purse sitting on the nearby coffee table. He looked inside of it and found a wallet with a driver's license inside. Despite all of the blood, he could still match the victim to the woman on this ID. The victim was Sarah Russ. Reddig knelt back down to get a better look at Sarah. He saw all the blood on her clothes and skin, and the blood on the walls and the floor had all dried. Reddig knew that the woman who had called police to do the wellness check said she'd gotten a frightening voicemail from the victim, from Sarah, the night before. So it seemed logical to him, especially based on the dried nature of the blood, that Sarah had already been dead for 24 hours or so. Reddig stood up, walked back outside, and joined several forensic technicians and police officers who had also just arrived at the scene. He told the officers to start by talking to the neighbors, many of whom were still standing around and watching from their porches, to see if any of them had seen anything strange or heard anything strange the night before. Reddig hoped, in a quiet neighborhood like this, that maybe somebody heard the sound of that window shattering and came outside to take a look. Maybe they saw something. As the forensics team entered Sarah's house and began searching for prints and DNA samples, Reddig also went back inside and began a full walkthrough of the house. As he did that, he noticed that somebody had clearly ransacked the place, but Reddig immediately thought this was all just staged to look like a robbery. It looked like a VCR had been pulled off its stand and stolen. There were VHS tapes littered all across the family room floor, and the kitchen drawers had all been pulled open. But Sarah's purse, with cash and credit cards in it, had been left behind on the coffee table, and so too had her jewelry and laptop, which were worth way more than a VCR. And so, Reddig did not think this looked like a robbery gone bad. Also, just the brutality of the murder itself backed up his theory. As far as he was concerned, there was no way Sarah had been killed just by some random burglar. After searching the house for well over an hour, Reddig reconvened with the rest of the team. Forensic technicians had found bloody handprints on the wall, but those just indicated that the killer had been wearing gloves. But they did find several bloody footprints leading from the family room to the broken window and into the front yard. They would use these prints and the blood on the body, walls, and the floor to see if they could get any DNA samples that might belong to the killer. The officers who had been out canvassing the neighborhood said that, unfortunately, nobody had seen or heard anything strange the night before. In fact, nobody had even noticed the shattered window at Sarah's house until the police arrived. This surprised Detective Reddig. I mean, this was not a neighborhood that experienced much crime at all. And so, he really hoped that somebody had heard that broken glass and maybe thought there was a break-in going on and went out to investigate, but clearly not. But even still, The forensics team had plenty of samples for testing, and because of the brutal, sort of rage-filled nature of the crime, Reddig felt like he could start narrowing down potential suspects to only people who had a close, intimate relationship with the victim, Sarah. Reddig also knew there was another huge piece of evidence that was not in the house, the voicemail message that her friend Laura got that might have recorded her murder. As late night turned into early morning, Detective Reddig arrived at Sarah's friend Laura's house. Laura was still wide awake, desperately waiting to hear any news about Sarah. And so, when she saw Reddig, she led him into her house and brought him into the front room. When they got there, Reddig just told her she should sit down. Laura sat down on the couch and began shaking her head. It was like she already knew what was coming. Reddig told her that he was so sorry, but police had found her, friend Sarah, dead inside of her home, and she had clearly been murdered. Even though Laura, by this point, had sort of been expecting the worst, she refused to accept this at first. She said there was no way Sarah was gone. It had to be a mistake. Reddig watched Laura completely break down on the couch, sobbing and just repeating that police must have made a mistake. He again told her how sorry he was, and eventually Laura did begin to breathe a bit easier. She wiped the tears from her eyes, and then she looked right at Reddig and said something that totally threw him for a loop. Laura told him that the police needed to arrest Sarah's soon-to-be ex-husband, Lorenzo, right away because he was the one who had killed her. Reddig was used to victims' friends and family suggesting who they thought might have committed a murder, but it was Laura's complete confidence that just seemed strange to him. He told Laura that Sarah's husband, Lorenzo, would definitely be brought in for questioning, especially considering, it sounded like they were going through a divorce. Generally speaking, spouses and intimate partners were always the first suspects in murder cases like this. But Laura told him it wasn't just that they were getting a divorce. It was also that Sarah and Lorenzo were in the middle of this nasty custody battle over their child. Laura said that Sarah was just plain terrified of Lorenzo. Laura told Reddig that Lorenzo had been living with his mother since he and Sarah had gotten separated. But one time, Lorenzo had shown up at Sarah's house and literally threatened to kill her. Sarah was so afraid that he would come back to hurt her and take their son far away from her that she kept the metal skillet under her bed as a weapon in case he ever showed up. Now, Reddig would obviously have to follow up on this claim. He had no idea if Laura was telling the truth or not, but it definitely seemed like Laura was being truthful, and he felt like he needed to act fast in case there was a chance that Lorenzo really was trying to leave town and take he and Sarah's son with him. And so, Reddig asked Laura for her answering machine. That way, police could study the message Sarah had left her. Laura said that was fine. She got up, unplugged the machine, and handed it to him. And then, very quickly, he left her house with the machine and rushed out to his car. On his way back to the station, Reddig called in to ask for any records they had on Lorenzo Luce. When he got back to his office, he found a file folder waiting for him on his desk. It would turn out Laura had been telling the truth. Sarah had called the police on her estranged husband, Lorenzo, a few months earlier, claiming he had threatened to kill her. Police had removed Lorenzo from the premises, and there was still a court order in place forbidding him from returning to Sarah's house. After reading this report, Reddig didn't waste any time. He requested a search warrant for Lorenzo's mom's house, Lorenzo's car, and for Lorenzo himself. This warrant would allow police to demand fingerprints and DNA samples from Lorenzo. Finally, Reddig sent 2 of his team members to Lorenzo's mother's house, where Lorenzo was living. They couldn't go into the house until the search warrant was granted, but Reddig wanted to have his eyes on Lorenzo, just in case he tried to make a run for it. By 10 a.m., on the 16th of November, so the day after Sarah's body was discovered, all of Detective Reddig's warrants had been approved. And so, even though he had just worked through the night and he was starting to feel exhausted, he still gathered up several members of his team, and they headed to Lorenzo's mom's house. At about the same time, Lorenzo stepped out of the house and got into his car to head to work. But before he could make it down the street, the 2 officers who'd already been there staking out the place pulled him over and told him to leave his car behind, and then they drove him to the police station. Reddig and his team arrived soon after that, and Reddig had Lorenzo's car impounded for forensic search. Then they headed to Lorenzo's mother's house, and they knocked on the front door. Lorenzo's mother, A small woman in her 60s named Amelia Russ opened up the door. She was carrying Sarah and Lorenzo's young son in her arms, and she looked genuinely frightened. She didn't understand why there were police at her house, but very quickly, Reddick broke the news to her. He told her that, unfortunately, her daughter-in-law, Sarah, had been killed the night before. And even though this was very abrupt and shocking for her, they did need to search her house and also ask her some questions. Emilia stared back at Reddick in total shock. She said that wasn't possible. Her son, Lorenzo, had just seen Sarah a couple of days ago to get their son. Reddick said he was terribly sorry, but this was the truth. And then he showed her the search warrant and said they really needed to come inside. Emilia nodded, still in shock, and led them inside. Then it was like she was on autopilot and just asked them if she could put the baby in his crib. Reddick said that was fine. And while Emilia sort of shuffled off, he instructed his team to do a thorough search of the house. A few minutes later, Amelia came back, still looking very confused and shocked, and she walked with Reddick into the kitchen. Reddick again apologized for the whole situation, and for having barged into her home like this, but quickly asked her, point blank, if she knew where her son Lorenzo had been on the night Sarah had been murdered. She told Reddick she had had a late shift at the retirement home where she worked that night, so she didn't know. But her other son Mike would know where Lorenzo had been. And so Amelia called out for Mike, and suddenly, this man in his late 20s walked into the kitchen. It was Mike, and he looked just as frightened as his mother. He clearly had just been listening intently to Detective Reddick and Amelia have this conversation about Sarah being murdered. And so Reddick, who could tell Mike already knew what happened, just asked the same question he had asked his mother. Did Mike know where Lorenzo had been on the night of Sarah's murder? Mike immediately stared down at the floor and just began shifting back and forth on his feet for a minute without saying anything. And then he looked up at Reddick and slowly nodded and said Lorenzo had actually been home that night. In fact, he and Lorenzo had hung out together that night for a little while before Mike had had to leave for a night shift at his job. Reddick thought Mike seemed like he was hesitating as he was saying this, and so he couldn't tell if Mike was just nervous or scared, or if he was trying to hide something. But either way, Reddick never put much stock in family-related alibis. Parents and siblings would often go to great lengths to protect a loved one, even if it meant lying to the police. And on top of that, even if this alibi were legitimate, Mike did not seem particularly clear on what time he actually left the house to go to that work shift. And so, really, this alibi did not let Lorenzo off the hook at all. After that, Reddick joined his team and searched the house. Nothing really jumped out at them, no piece of evidence that made it clear Lorenzo could be a killer. But they were able to pull some fingerprints, and they collected a number of physical items that could be evidence that might help the investigation later. That day, Detective Reddick returned to the police station and met with one of the investigators who had picked up Lorenzo. And this investigator told Reddick that there was something really strange about this whole thing. He said that when he and his partner met Lorenzo, one of the first things they told him was that his wife had been killed. And Lorenzo reacted by bending over and heaving and sobbing. But then, when he stood back up again, it was clear he had not actually been crying at all. It was all an act. Now, Reddick didn't want to jump to conclusions here, but it was hard to deny that things were really lining up against Lorenzo. He was already an estranged husband in a heated custody battle who had previously threatened the victim, and now he seemed to be fake crying at the news of his wife's murder. The investigator told Reddick that Lorenzo was in an interview room, so Reddick grabbed the cup of coffee and headed that way. And after a few minutes of talking to Lorenzo, Reddick felt like his case was only getting stronger. The conversation they had was relatively short and to the point. Lorenzo said he was at his mother's house at the time Sarah had supposedly been killed, just like his brother Mike had said. Lorenzo also made it clear that despite all of the custody issues, he still cared about Sarah a lot, and he would never hurt her. But it was not Lorenzo's answers or his sort of flimsy family alibi that made Reddick feel like Lorenzo was now definitely his primary suspect. Instead, it was Lorenzo's attitude during the short interview. Reddick thought every answer this man gave him sounded smug and arrogant. And when he talked about his wife's death, he didn't show any emotion at all. despite the huge crying display he'd put on for the other investigators when they first told him about it. At the end of the interview, Reddick called in an officer to take Lorenzo's fingerprints and to swab his cheek for a DNA sample. After that, Reddick wanted to keep Lorenzo in custody, but he didn't have enough evidence to do that, so he had to let him go. But Reddick felt confident that it was only a matter of time before Lorenzo would be back at the station, back in police custody. On the 20th of November, 6 days after Sarah's murder, her friends and family gathered at a local church for her funeral. And they were joined by people from the community who didn't even know Sarah, but who had followed her story closely on the local news day after day. Detective Reddick and members of his team also attended, and it struck Reddick that everyone who spoke at the service was so bright and positive when speaking about Sarah. Even though everybody was still in shock and heartbroken, they said Sarah had spent her life being happy and spreading joy, so they wanted to honor her by doing the same, even now at her funeral. But that was not the only thing about the funeral that stood out to Reddick. It was common for investigators to attend funerals of murder victims, specifically to watch how potential suspects might react. But Reddick couldn't really fully do that, because his primary suspect wasn't even there. Lorenzo and his family had not shown up to Sarah's funeral. About a week after the funeral, Reddick was sitting at his desk going over notes from the search of Lorenzo's mother's house. Nothing had really come from the search so far, and he was starting to feel stuck. He was still waiting on DNA test results from the crime scene and Lorenzo's car, and without these results or some clear evidence from the search, he still couldn't move in on Lorenzo, or anyone else for that matter. Just then, Reddick heard somebody call his name, and he looked up, and he saw an excited officer flagging him down, telling him there was something he needed to hear right away. And so, Reddick followed this officer down the hallway to a small room, where a member of the investigative team was hunched over Laura's answering machine. This investigator had spent days trying to break down the voicemail recording of the breathing and the screaming and the crying into small sections to see if he could isolate anything that would help. The investigator, when they saw Reddick, waved him over and rewound the voicemail Sarah had left on the night of the murder and played it back. And when it reached a certain spot, the investigator stopped the message and looked at Reddick like he had just discovered something major. But Reddick just shook his head and said he wasn't really sure what he was supposed to have just heard. And so, the investigator rewound the message again, played it, and then stopped it at that same point. And then did it a few more times, going back to the beginning, playing it, and stopping it at that exact same spot. And eventually, Detective Reddick knew why the investigator was so excited, because in the middle of all the screaming and the crying they had just listened to, Reddick thought he heard Sarah say one word, a name, Mike. Detective Reddick quickly dispatched 2 officers to pick up Lorenzo's younger brother, whose name was Mike, and they found him at his mother's house. Later that day, Reddick sat in an interview room across from Mike, just like he'd done with Lorenzo. But after only a few minutes of speaking to Mike, Reddick felt like these 2 brothers could not be more different. Where Lorenzo had come off as arrogant and uncaring, Mike seemed shy and sensitive. Talking about Sarah's murder clearly upset him. Reddick wondered if maybe Lorenzo, the older and seemingly more domineering of the brothers, had pushed Mike to maybe murder Sarah on his behalf. But Mike stuck to the same story he told Reddick when they met at the house. He said he had seen Lorenzo at home before he headed out to work. After the interview, Mike agreed to provide some DNA samples, and he also asked if someone could drive him to work because he didn't want to be late. Reddick said he'd be happy to, and before long, he was driving Mike across town to his job. And as they drove, Reddick didn't push Mike too hard, but he did say he thought Mike knew more about the murder than he was letting on. Mike didn't respond. However, when Reddick dropped him off at work, Mike stepped out of the car and then fell to the ground and started vomiting. Reddick immediately got out and helped Mike stand back up and get him cleaned off. But as he watched Mike walk into work, Reddick now felt completely sure that Mike, and maybe even his mom, Amelia, were hiding information about Lorenzo. As 1998 approached its end, Detective Reddick still felt sure he knew who the killer was. Either Lorenzo had done it himself, or he had gotten someone to do it for him, most likely his younger brother, Mike. But before New Year's, the detective got the DNA results he'd been waiting for, and nothing from the crime scene matched Lorenzo or Mike's DNA. This shocked Reddick. He'd been so sure this case was just about closed, but without this scientific evidence, or any other real hard evidence to back him up, he couldn't do anything. So, Reddick started to question his own theories about the case. Had he been so locked in on Lorenzo and Mike that he'd ignored other evidence? He went back to the beginning and tried to see what he could have overlooked, and so he dug into Sarah's job at the NSA, thinking maybe the murder could have some connection to her role there. It did seem far-fetched, but if she was involved with sensitive intelligence reports, he at least wanted to look into that. Reddick reached out to a contact at the NSA, and they told him they would look into it. But within days, the NSA contacted Reddick to tell him there was nothing they could find about Sarah's murder that seemed even remotely connected to her work. The fact that Reddick had gone from feeling like he was close to bringing Sarah's killer to justice to feeling like he suddenly had nothing to go on started to weigh heavily on him. He began having trouble sleeping, and he also started seeing that horrific image of Sarah lying there in her house all the time. But no matter what avenue he pursued, nothing new turned up. And so now, this case, which had seemed like a slam dunk, started to go cold. On a night in January of 1999, 2 months after Sarah's murder, a 19-year-old sat in his car in the parking lot of a Baltimore McDonald's. The teenager pulled a ski mask down over his face, grabbed a revolver from the passenger seat, and stepped out of the car. He quickly walked across the parking lot, stepped into the near-empty fast food restaurant, raised his gun, and started yelling for everyone who was in there to stay where they were and for the employee behind the counter to hand over all the money from the register. The employee began to panic and couldn't quite get the register open, and so his manager quickly rushed to the counter to help. At the same time, the manager told the teenager with the gun to please calm down and that he would get the money out of the register, just hold on. But the teenager kept waving his gun and yelling at the manager to hurry up. It was taking too long. The manager kept saying he was working on it. And then finally, he opened up the register, at which point the teenager with the gun lunged over the counter and began grabbing the money. But at the same time, the manager of the restaurant must have done something to spook the teen, because the teenager fired his gun, and the bullet hit them. The manager, the employees, and the few people in the restaurant began screaming as the teenager ran out of the restaurant with the little bit of money he had in his hand. But the cops were already swarming. On an afternoon in August of 1999, so 7 months after the fast food restaurant robbery, and 9 months after Sarah's murder, an officer rushed over to Detective Reddick's desk and told him there was a phone call he had to take. Reddick went to the officer's desk and grabbed the phone, and a detective from nearby Baltimore County introduced himself. This Baltimore County detective said he was pretty sure Reddick had not heard about a Baltimore County McDonald's getting robbed at the beginning of the year. Reddick sort of laughed and said that he had not heard anything about that. The Baltimore County detective said it was the craziest thing, but the person who had robbed that McDonald's and actually shot the manager of that McDonald's was a 19-year-old kid named Ardale Tickles. This kid was in jail for the robbery and the shooting, and recently he'd begun bragging to other inmates that he knew everything about the murder that had been all over the television, the one where the woman had been killed in Howard County, Sarah Russ. Detective Reddick felt a rush, and he almost didn't know what to say. He'd reached the point where he wasn't sure if he'd ever find any new evidence in Sarah's murder. Still, Reddick knew that inmates often bragged about murders they knew nothing about, especially if those murders had been all over the news for weeks like Sarah's had. The other detective agreed with Reddick, but he said this was different. He was nearly positive that this kid, Ardale Tickles, had been giving away details of this murder that police had never released to the public. Reddick thanked the detective for the call and said he was heading that way right now. As he rushed out to his car, Reddick felt more optimistic than he had in months, and he thought he might finally find justice for Sarah. After meeting with the young inmate Ardale, Detective Reddick was sure Ardale was telling the truth. He did know things that only the killer or someone who had at least spoken to the killer would know. It would take a little more time for Reddick and his team to get the concrete evidence they needed, but almost exactly a year after the investigation began, they finally knew who had murdered Sarah Russ. Based on Ardale's interview, DNA testing, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what happened to Sarah on the night of the 14th of November, 1998. On that night, the killer sat in their car, a few houses down from Sarah. They slipped on a pair of leather gloves, checked the hunting knife sheathed on their hip, and stepped outside. The killer wore all black, and they moved quickly towards Sarah's house, being careful to stay out of the glow from the streetlights. They ran across Sarah's yard to a window near the front door, crouched down and looked inside the house. From this spot, they could see Sarah sitting at her computer in the family room. The killer raised up their elbow and slammed it into the glass. The window shattered, and the killer unearthed their knife, climbed through the broken window, making sure to avoid the shards of glass, and ran right towards Sarah, who was already up on her feet running towards the phone that was on an end table. But the killer grabbed Sarah and slammed the hunting knife into her back, just as Sarah picked up the phone. The killer kept stabbing Sarah over and over as she desperately tried to dial 911 -1. She didn't manage to do that, but did hit a special speed dial button on her phone that called her best friend, Laura. The killer sliced Sarah's hand, and she and the phone fell to the floor. The killer crouched down and stabbed Sarah in the chest again and again until she was barely breathing, and then the killer slit her throat. Sarah died there on the floor, but the killer kept digging into her neck with a knife. As they grew more and more crazed, they stabbed Sarah's chest again and then hacked away at her wrists. Finally, the killer saw all the blood on the floor and the walls, and they stood up and backed away from Sarah's body. They ran across the room, grabbed the VCR, and threw some VHS tapes on the floor before heading to the kitchen to throw open some drawers. The killer had wanted to make this look like a robbery, but even they knew this was a very weak attempt, and they didn't want to spend any more time in that house. So they ran back to the broken window, climbed through it, and sprinted across the yard and down the street to their car. And to their shock, the neighborhood still remained completely quiet. Nobody knew. The killer tossed the stolen VCR into the passenger seat, gunned the engine, and sped away from the secluded suburban neighborhood. The following day, they went into work at a retirement home and told the woman they worked with that the job was done. Ardale Tickles, the 19-year-old who robbed the McDonald's and shot the manager, also murdered Sarah. But Ardale had no personal connection to Sarah at all. He just happened to work at the retirement home with Sarah's mother-in-law, Amelia, and it turned out Amelia wanted Sarah dead. Amelia never thought Sarah was good enough for her son, Lorenzo. She claimed Sarah was a loose woman and was having all these online relationships with other men. Now, even though there was absolutely no proof of this, Amelia still did not want Lorenzo to be with Sarah, and these feelings only got worse when Sarah and Lorenzo had a baby together. Amelia thought Sarah was a terrible mother, and so whenever Amelia would babysit, she would give Sarah all this unsolicited, extensive parenting advice. But Sarah often rejected her advice, and so Amelia felt disrespected and angry on top of detesting Sarah. And so, when Sarah filed for divorce and tried to gain full custody of her grandson, Amelia decided Sarah had to die. Now, Amelia knew she could not carry out the murder herself, so she offered Ardale, the 19-year-old young man she worked with, $3,000 to murder Sarah for her, and Ardale accepted. And for several months after the murder, it looked like Amelia might actually get away with it. Detective Reddick had focused the bulk of his investigation on Amelia's sons Lorenzo and his brother Mike. Reddick had never even considered Amelia a suspect. And when no concrete evidence against her son surfaced, Amelia believed investigators would just leave the family alone and go down some other path. But in early 1999, Ardale robbed the McDonald's and shot the manager, got caught, and while he was in jail began bragging to other inmates about how he'd been involved in a highly publicized murder. When Reddick and detectives from Baltimore County interviewed Ardale, he admitted to killing Sarah. It didn't take long for them to connect Ardale and Amelia through their work, and they also eventually connected a bank withdrawal Amelia had made to the payment she'd given Ardale. And so it was clear she had arranged the murder. Police do not believe Lorenzo had any idea what his mother was doing. And although investigators were convinced Lorenzo's brother Mike knew more than he was letting on, it was never proven that he had any knowledge of what his mother had done. On top of that, the FBI later conducted a detailed analysis of that voicemail that had been left on Laura's answering machine. The voicemail that basically captured Sarah's murder, and they determined that the word Mike had not actually been said on the tape. It was just a sound that could have been mistaken for the name. And so, as a result, the district attorney's office focused their case solely on Amelia and Ardale. Ardale pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a possibility for parole as early as 2024. As for Amelia, she was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole.
The Colonial Parkway had always been a place where history and nature coexisted. Couples would drive late into the evening, windows down, music low, sharing whispered conversations about college, work, or dreams of the future. It was a place where young love could feel safe, far from the city and its dangers. But between 1986 and 1989, that sense of safety was shattered in a way that left the entire region holding its breath. It began with small disappearances, seemingly ordinary at first. A car left parked along a quiet turn. A college student missing after a weekend drive. The initial assumption was always simple: perhaps the couple had a fight, maybe they left for another town, maybe it was just a late night that ran too long. But then the pattern emerged. Cars abandoned with no explanation. Belongings untouched. And in every case, when authorities finally found the victims, the horror was undeniable. They had been shot, execution style, at close range, sometimes still slumped in their seats or lying nearby, as if the killer had approached silently and struck without warning. What unsettled investigators most wasn't just the violence, but the precision. There was no sign of struggle. No frantic attempts to flee. It was as if the victims had been frozen in the moment, and the killer had moved through the scene with complete control. Patrols were increased, officers staked out parking areas and pull-offs, and yet the attacks continued. It became clear that whoever was responsible understood the parkway in a way outsiders could not, knew the curves, the hidden spots, the places where no one else would be. Eyewitness accounts were scarce, but each one added another piece to a puzzle that seemed impossible to complete. A couple reported seeing headlights in the distance, parked unnaturally in the woods. A jogger remembered hearing faint footsteps just off the road. There were rumors of cars following other cars late at night, of shadowy figures slipping between vanishing before anyone could confirm their presence. Yet nothing concrete ever emerged, just hints of something lurking, patient, watching. The pattern of the attack suggested more than opportunistic violence. These were not crimes of passion or random encounters. The killer or killers selected their victims carefully, targeting young couples who were alone, isolated, and vulnerable. There was a methodical quality to it, a chilling calculation that spoke to experience and planning. Detectives began to suspect someone intimately familiar with the area, someone who could strike and disappear without leaving a trace. For the families and friends of the victims, the terror went beyond grief. It was the knowledge that someone was out there, waiting, patient, and perhaps still watching. College students who had once considered the parkway a shortcut home now avoided it entirely. Lovers drove with heightened awareness, scanning every curve for headlights, every shadow for movement. A place that had once been serene had transformed into something alive with fear, every darkened pull-off a reminder of the violence that had already occurred. The investigators who worked the case described it as some of the most frustrating and haunting work of their careers. They could see the logic behind the attacks, the control, the precision, but the killer remained elusive. Every lead ended in a dead end, every tip brought only speculation. The pattern was clear, but the perpetrator was not. And as the bodies accumulated and the years passed, the Colonial Parkway earned a reputation that it would never shake, a road where beauty and terror collided, where young love could be snuffed out in an instant, and where the shadows themselves seemed to hide someone patient, calculated, and invisible. Even decades later, the parkway carries that weight. Locals drive it with caution, whispering about the murders in quiet tones, almost afraid to speak too loudly. Tourists sometimes pause to take in the scenery, oblivious to the dark history beneath the trees and curves. And somewhere in the back of the mind of anyone who knows the story is the lingering question: who was watching, waiting, and how many more times could it have happened without anyone knowing? Investigators began mapping the attacks, trying to find a rhythm, a signature, something that would explain the killer's behavior. And the more they looked, the more unnerving the pattern became. Almost every victim was a young couple, late teens or early 20s. They weren't strangers to the area, they were locals or college students, often on dates, enjoying what they thought was a carefree night drive. Sometimes they were just leaving a party, sometimes returning from the beach. There was no apparent reason for the killer to choose them, no obvious connection between the pairs, no history that tied them together outside of the parkway. The attacks always happened in the same types of locations, secluded, isolated, and perfectly suited for ambush. Hidden curves, long stretches of road with no streetlights, pull-offs that felt safe but were anything but. Some spots were visible from the road but obscured from any passing car, places where someone could watch for hours without being seen. Others were tucked into wooded areas where the sounds of struggle could be masked by the forest. The killer or killers had a terrifying understanding of human behavior. They knew where people would feel safe and how to exploit that trust. Cars became grim evidence of the pattern itself. Some were found with keys still in the ignition, as if the driver had planned to return but never could. Others were partially parked, tires angled oddly, doors unlocked, windows down. Every detail suggested that the victims had no warning, no chance to react, no reason to suspect danger. It wasn't that the killer struck randomly, it was that he knew how to make the victims feel secure until it was too late. The method was equally calculated. Most victims were shot at close range, some multiple times, with no indication of a struggle. It was as if the killer had practiced, rehearsed, or studied the act itself. In some cases, the bodies were positioned in ways that suggested an eerie familiarity with how humans respond to fear. The absence of defensive wounds in several victims only added to the unease. This wasn't just murder, it was control, and control executed with terrifying confidence. For investigators, the lack of physical evidence was maddening. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no traceable DNA, or at least none that could be identified with the technology of the time. Car doors unlocked, belongings left behind, no signs of robbery. The scene suggested planning at a level most law enforcement hadn't seen in a local case before. Someone knew how to strike without leaving a trail, how to move through these wooded corridors without detection. The killer, or killers, were not amateurs. They were methodical, patient, and likely familiar with law enforcement patterns, knowing what would and wouldn't attract attention. This level of planning suggested more than simple malice, it suggested someone with patience and the ability to manipulate not just the victims but the environment itself. Officers studied the topography of the parkway, looking for patterns in elevation, line of sight, and distances from houses or roads. Some of the pull-offs were near shallow riverbanks, others near the edge of the forest where headlights couldn't penetrate. The killers seemed to know precisely how far they could operate without being caught, and this level of control unsettled investigators more than the murders themselves. The psychological implications were even more disturbing. By targeting couples, people in vulnerable, trusting situations, the killer was preying on intimacy itself. A car ride at night is supposed to be private, a time for connection and conversation. Yet these same moments became death traps. Experts speculated that the killer derived satisfaction from the betrayal of that trust, from taking what was ordinary and safe and turning it into something horrifying. The attacks weren't just about killing, they were about control, dominance, and fear. Investigators also noticed a subtle escalation. Early victims were found relatively close to populated areas, later victims were discovered in increasingly remote spots. It was almost as if the killer's confidence grew over time, their comfort with the parkway and with the act of murder deepening. They seemed to be testing the limits of law enforcement, seeing how far they could operate without detection. And with every attack, the sense of invincibility grew. The community, meanwhile, began to feel the pressure. Couples who once drove the parkway freely at night stopped doing so. Parents forbade late-night drives. Students at nearby colleges whispered about strange cars parked in the woods or figures glimpsed among the trees. Every curve, every pull-off, became a potential threat. The parkway, which had once been a symbol of scenic beauty and historical charm, had transformed into a place of paranoia. People spoke of a watcher in the woods, a ghostly presence that could strike anywhere along the 23-mile stretch. Law enforcement struggled to match the killer's planning. Patrols were increased, but the attacks continued. Investigators conducted stakeouts, sometimes for hours at a time, but the parkway's length and the killer's patience made it nearly impossible to predict the next move. Descriptions from the rare witnesses were often vague: headlights in the distance, a car parked strangely, a silhouette in the trees. Nothing conclusive. Each lead dissolved into frustration, leaving officers feeling powerless. The killer's confidence was mirrored in the audacity of the crimes themselves. There was no hurried escape, no reckless movement. The attacks were executed with precision and timing. It was as if the killer had rehearsed the entire scenario, identifying a couple, following them until the right moment, striking, and then vanishing without a trace. To the victims, there was no warning. To the investigators, there was no pattern that could be broken without luck or a new piece of evidence. And yet, there was a haunting consistency. The selection of victims, the locations, the method, all pointed to someone intimately familiar with the road, the area, and human behavior. It was clear that this wasn't a transient criminal, this was someone rooted in the region, someone who knew the parkway as well as anyone who had lived nearby for years. By the end of the 1980s, law enforcement was exhausted but determined. They had identified the pattern, understood the modus operandi, and recognized the psychological profile: a patient, calculating, and confident individual, possibly with military or law enforcement experience, who knew how to exploit both terrain and human trust. But even with all this knowledge, the killer remained unseen, untouchable, and unknown. The Colonial Parkway had become a hunting ground, and the killer had become a phantom, a presence felt but never caught, lurking in the shadows of history. Each discovery of an abandoned car, each report of a couple gone missing, reinforced the terrifying realization: the murderer could strike again at any moment, anywhere along those winding roads. And with no evidence to tie a suspect to the crimes, the fear of the unknown loomed larger than the crimes themselves. Even today, the parkway carries that shadow. Visitors see only trees, curves, and rivers, but the memory of the attacks, the precision, the secrecy, the absolute control the killer wielded, lingers. It's a chilling reminder that some predators aren't strangers in the night. Sometimes, they're patient, methodical, and disturbingly familiar, waiting in plain sight along a road that looks safe but has never truly been safe at all. Despite the urgency and public attention, the investigation into the Colonial Parkway murders quickly proved more complex than anyone anticipated. Hundreds of tips poured in from frightened locals, anonymous callers, and concerned relatives, each one promising a lead but delivering little more than a shadow. Some claimed to have seen suspicious vehicles along the parkway late at night, while others remembered a figure lurking near a wooded pull-off. Every tip required follow-up, and yet none led to a breakthrough. The sheer volume became overwhelming, and many leads went cold within days. At first, law enforcement suspected multiple offenders. The murders appeared to vary slightly in execution: some victims shot inside the car, others outside, some bodies left in plain view, others partially hidden. This variation suggested different hands or personalities. Detectives speculated that perhaps a pair of killers had operated in tandem, one providing control, the other carrying out the act. But as the case unfolded, the evidence began to point toward a single, highly methodical individual. The precision of the attacks, the careful selection of locations, the timing, the clean execution, suggested someone who had studied the victims, the road, and the terrain with meticulous attention. Thousands of interviews were conducted. Investigators knocked on doors in Williamsburg, Yorktown, Jamestown, and beyond, questioning anyone who might have seen a car parked late at night or noticed a stranger in the woods. People remembered minor details: an unfamiliar face at a party, a strange man at a gas station, headlights flickering in the trees, but every account was anecdotal. And nothing could be substantiated. Those who were considered suspects often had alibis or no connection strong enough to hold in court. Some were questioned repeatedly, their frustration growing as investigators pushed for something concrete that never materialized. Records of local criminals were meticulously examined. Investigators scoured arrest logs, parole records, and civil complaints, searching for anyone with a history of violence, sexual offenses, or suspicious behavior along the parkway. Patterns were analyzed, but nothing aligned with the timing or methods of the murders. There were people who seemed to fit parts of the profile, men who were violent, erratic, or known to lurk near isolated areas, but each one failed to provide a complete picture. It was as if the killer had erased themselves from any official record, leaving behind only the haunting echoes of their crimes. Forensic science, or rather the lack of it, played a critical role in the slow progress. In the late 1980s, DNA analysis was in its infancy. Shell casings from the murder weapon were preserved, tire tracks were photographed, and fibers were collected, but the technology of the day couldn't extract the clues that decades later would become crucial. Investigators could compare weapon types and calibers, measure bullet trajectories, and analyze the position of victims' bodies, but without DNA or definitive physical links, every lead remained speculative. The absence of concrete forensic evidence left the case in a frustrating limbo. Even the crime scenes themselves offered little to guide investigators. Cars were abandoned in ways that suggested the victims intended to return, yet no struggle had occurred. There were no personal items missing, no apparent motive of robbery or random aggression. Each scene had a disturbing quality of control, as if the killer had rehearsed the attacks and carefully orchestrated them. Detectives noted subtle consistencies: the locations were remote but accessible, the shootings executed quietly, and the killer's approach left almost no trace beyond the aftermath. These details were enough to unsettle anyone studying the case, but not enough to catch the perpetrator. By the early 1990s, frustration had mounted. The trail had gone cold. Families were left without closure, grappling with the incomprehensible loss of loved ones. For the young men and women whose lives were cut short, there would be no funeral that answered the most pressing question: why? And for the communities surrounding the Colonial Parkway, the murders were no longer just a series of tragic events, they became a collective shadow. Residents avoided night drives, parents warned their children to stay on well-lit roads, and whispers of a stalker in the woods grew into local legend. Media coverage added another layer of complexity. Newspapers ran stories detailing the sequence of murders, interviews with grieving families, and theories about suspects. Television news crews arrived to film the scenic road, contrasting its idyllic beauty with the violence that had marred it. The coverage kept public attention alive, but it also fueled fear. Every curve, every pull-off, every stretch of forest became a potential threat. The parkway, once known for history and romance, became synonymous with terror. The investigative challenges were compounded by the passage of time. Witnesses' memories faded, records were misplaced, and key details were lost in the shuffle of case files. Detectives who had worked the murders began retiring, leaving a knowledge gap that slowed the continuity of the investigation. Coordination between local, state, and federal agencies was imperfect, sometimes leaving questions unanswered for months. And every year that passed without an arrest deepened the sense that the killer had become untouchable. Criminal profilers brought in to assist painted a chilling picture. The killer was likely someone who understood human behavior, who could exploit intimacy and trust to his advantage. The selection of young couples suggested someone targeting vulnerability, the kind of predatory pattern rarely seen in random acts of violence. Profiles speculated that the killer might have experience in law enforcement, the military, or another structured environment that required patience and attention to detail. But these were educated guesses, not evidence. And with each unanswered question, the sense of dread surrounding the parkway only grew. Community members began to speculate. Some believed the killer was still local, possibly someone who drove the same roads each night under the guise of normal life. Others suspected an outsider, someone who had studied the area extensively and disappeared before law enforcement could close in. Rumors circulated of suspicious cars parked along the parkway late at night, of headlights flickering in the trees, of shadowy figures glimpsed from passing vehicles. But every report was anecdotal, impossible to verify, and left a lingering tension that the community could not shake. The murders, in their methodical cruelty, left investigators frustrated not just by the lack of evidence but by the psychological torment of understanding the killer's mindset. The precision, the control, the patience, it was all deliberate. The killer's ability to strike repeatedly without being detected suggested someone comfortable with risk, confident in their ability to evade consequences. It was as if each attack was not just about murder but a demonstration of mastery, a way to assert dominance over both victims and the law itself. By the mid-1990s, the Colonial Parkway murders had become one of Virginia's most infamous unsolved cases. The trail of fear and loss stretched beyond the victims' families to the entire region. Couples drove cautiously, teenagers dared each other to approach the parkway at night, and historians and true crime writers began chronicling the events as a dark chapter in Virginia's history. Law enforcement kept the case open, re-examining evidence when new technology emerged, but the killer remained beyond reach. Even decades later, the story of the Colonial Parkway murders is remembered not just for the brutality but for the frustration it imposed on investigators and the fear it instilled in an entire region. The killer's identity remains a ghost, a shadow that moved silently through the trees, leaving a legacy of terror and unanswered questions. For the families, the community, and anyone who has studied the case, the haunting truth is clear: some predators are patient, methodical, and terrifyingly clever, and even with every resource available, they may never be caught. The Colonial Parkway, once a symbol of scenic beauty and romance, will forever carry the memory of those lost. Every quiet curve, every hidden pull-off, every stretch of forested road is a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight. And for those who lived through the 1980s in southeastern Virginia, the fear that something unseen was always watching has never fully faded. As the Colonial Parkway investigation dragged on, the spotlight inevitably turned toward potential suspects. Law enforcement considered everyone, from local troublemakers to transient outsiders, but the more they looked, the more unsettling the picture became. The killer, whoever they were, didn't seem random. The selection of victims, young couples alone at night, suggested someone who understood human behavior intimately. They were picking targets who were vulnerable, trusting, and isolated. That level of observation implied patience, intelligence, and a degree of cold calculation that investigators could not ignore. Some of the first suspects were local men with criminal histories, people known to police for violence, theft, or assault offenses. One man had been arrested for assault in the 1970s, a history that included confrontations with young couples. Another had a reputation for stalking, lingering near bars and college campuses late at night. But despite being persons of interest, none of these men could be conclusively tied to the crimes. Alibis were established, witnesses were inconsistent, and crucial evidence, fingerprints, DNA, was either missing or unusable. Every lead that seemed promising ended in frustration. Investigators also considered the possibility of someone transient, a drifter familiar with the roads and the forested areas surrounding the parkway. Several reports came in of suspicious vehicles at odd hours, often with headlights off or parked strangely along wooded stretches. One couple claimed to have been followed on the parkway late at night by a dark sedan, only to lose sight of it after a turn. Another witness remembered a man who appeared to be watching from the trees as they passed. While none of these accounts led to a suspect, they added to the chilling narrative: someone was observing, learning, and exploiting patterns. Criminal profilers brought in to consult on the case painted a disturbing psychological picture. They suggested the killer could be someone with experience in law enforcement, the military, or a profession that demanded patience and meticulous attention to detail. Someone capable of remaining calm under stress, someone able to plan several steps ahead. The precision of the murders, The careful selection of pull-offs, the methodical execution, reinforced this profile. The killer was confident, deliberate, and entirely comfortable in their environment. As years passed, theories multiplied. Some speculated that the killer could have been a local man who drove the same roads nightly, blending into normal life while targeting unsuspecting couples. Others suggested a stranger with transient patterns, someone moving through the area in cycles, striking and then disappearing before law enforcement could respond. Some investigators even proposed a copycat scenario, though the consistent method and pattern of execution across years suggested a single offender. Despite the speculation, frustration mounted. No arrest was ever made, and no charges were brought. Evidence that might have pointed to a suspect, the tire tracks, the shell casings, even eyewitness accounts, had either degraded over time or proved inconclusive. The case became a haunting reminder of the limits of investigative tools in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and of the patience and cunning of a killer who seemed to be always one step ahead. The community, meanwhile, developed its own narrative. Locals whispered about a ghost of the parkway, a presence that watched from the woods, invisible but ever present. Teenagers dared each other to drive at night along the road, some claiming to hear strange sounds or see headlights vanish around bends. Parents warned their children to avoid the area after dark. Even decades later, the sense of unease persists, a reminder that the murders left a mark on the landscape itself, a scar on the region's collective memory. Books, documentaries, and true crime podcasts later dissected the case, exploring every suspect, every theory, and every missed opportunity. Analysts debated whether the killer had died, moved away, or simply blended into the community, unseen and unreported. Some suggested he was someone entirely ordinary by day, someone whose neighbors never suspected a thing. Others feared he might still be alive, watching the parkway from afar, a shadow in plain sight. The Colonial Parkway murders remain unsolved to this day. Families continue to hope for closure, investigators still hold on to pieces of evidence, and the road itself carries an air of quiet dread. Each turn, each secluded pull-off, is a reminder of what happened there and of the person, or people, responsible who slipped through every net law enforcement tried to set. For those who lived through it, and those who study it now, the fear is enduring. The case is not just about what was done, but about the meticulous, patient, and methodical way it was carried out. It's a stark illustration that evil can be deliberate, calculated, and sometimes impossible to catch. And for the young couples who once drove that road in peace, the parkway will always be a place where trust met terror in the most horrifying way imaginable. Decades have passed since the first murders along the Colonial Parkway, but the road has never been the same. What was once a scenic drive through Virginia's historic countryside became a symbol of fear, a place where families and couples once felt safe but now whispered warnings to one another. The murders left more than bodies behind, they left a shadow, a lingering unease that no patrol or investigative breakthrough could erase. Law enforcement never solved the case. Despite modern forensic advances, DNA retesting, and decades of analysis, the killer, or killers, remained beyond reach. Suspects were questioned, leads were followed, and criminal profilers built detailed psychological profiles, but nothing resulted in arrests. The methodical, patient execution of the attack suggested someone capable of slipping in and out of society unnoticed, someone who could plan and strike without leaving a trace. It was a level of cunning that left even experienced detectives baffled. For families, the lack of answers was devastating. Parents who lost children on the parkway never received closure. Siblings and friends were left with haunting questions. Why them? Could it have been prevented? And, most chillingly, was the person responsible still out there, blending in among neighbors, co-workers, and strangers, unseen yet ever present? The community itself changed. Couples stopped taking late-night drives along the parkway. Locals learned to be hyper-aware of their surroundings, and every quiet pull-off, every hidden curve, was viewed with suspicion. Teenagers dared each other to visit the scene of the murders, often claiming to see ghostly lights or shadows. Some avoided the parkway entirely. The road, once a symbol of scenic romance and history, had been transformed into a landscape of caution and whispered fear. True crime enthusiasts and researchers continue to study the case, dissecting timelines, revisiting old evidence, and analyzing the psychological profile of the killer. Theories abound. Some believe the killer died without confessing, others think they moved away, and a few fear he may still be alive, watching the road and waiting for opportunity. Every twist in the case, every unanswered question, serves as a reminder of how patient and calculating a killer can be, and how elusive justice sometimes becomes. The Colonial Parkway murders endure in the American imagination as one of the most haunting unsolved cases. It is a story not just of violence, but of control, patience, and meticulous planning. The murders serve as a chilling reminder that evil can hide in plain sight and that some predators are careful, methodical, and disturbingly familiar. Even today, if you drive the Colonial Parkway at night, the scenic rivers, dense forests, and winding curves are beautiful, but they carry the memory of what happened there. The road's history is written in whispers: young couples who vanished, a killer who disappeared, and a community forever changed. And that is what makes the Colonial Parkway murders not just a story of crime, but a story of horror, patience, and enduring mystery, a story that refuses to be forgotten. In 1976, Circleville, Ohio, looked like the kind of place where nothing unusual ever happened. Small town, quiet streets, everybody knew everybody. But then something started creeping into the lives of the people there. Letters. Dozens of them. They were handwritten in uneven block capital letters, with no signature, no clue who sent them. Each envelope was postmarked from Columbus, 30 miles away. And these weren't friendly notes. The writer seemed to know people's secrets. Affairs, lies, even crimes that no one else should have known about. Whoever it was, they wanted to expose Circleville's dirty laundry. One woman quickly became the main target, Mary Gillespie. She was a school bus driver, a mother, and well-liked in the community. Her first letter accused her of having an affair with the local school superintendent, Gordon Massey. The writer demanded she end it immediately or face dire consequences. Mary kept the letter hidden, thinking maybe it was just a mean-spirited prank. But more letters followed, each more aggressive than the last. Soon her husband Ron started getting them too. The writer threatened to harm their children if Mary didn't stop the supposed affair. The Gillespies tried to carry on with their lives, but the letters just kept coming. Hundreds of them poured into Circleville over the years, hitting not just Mary, but dozens of townspeople. Each one in that same blocky handwriting. Each one exposing secrets that many believed no outsider could possibly know. By the summer of 1977, things escalated. Ron received a call one night, believed to be from the letter writer. Furious, he grabbed his gun, stormed out of the house, and got into his truck. Not long after, his vehicle was found crashed into a tree. Ron was dead. His gun had been fired once, though no bullet was ever found. Investigators couldn't determine if it was an accident or something more sinister. To this day, how Ron died remains one of the biggest mysteries in the sea. After Ron's death, the letters kept coming, and Mary's nightmare got worse. In 1983, while driving her bus route, she noticed something odd along the road, a sign with yet another threatening message about her. As she pulled it down, she realized it was booby trap. Behind the sign was a crude homemade gun rigged to fire at whoever tried to remove it. Mary narrowly escaped being killed. Police traced the gun and eventually arrested a man named Paul Freshour, Mary's former brother-in-law. Paul and his wife had gone through a bitter divorce, and many suspected he might have been behind the letters. Investigators said the gun used in the booby trap belonged to him. In 1984, Paul was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But here's where things get strange. After Paul was locked up, the letters didn't stop. They kept arriving in Circleville, still in the same blocky handwriting. Paul even received one himself in prison, taunting him. He swore he had nothing to do with them. And even after his release in the 1990s, the letters continued for a while before finally stopping. The case remains unsolved. Some believe Paul was guilty, others think he was framed, and a few insist there was more than one letter writer. Whoever it was, they managed to terrorize an entire town for nearly 2 decades without ever being caught. To this day, no one knows who the Circleville letter writer really was. The letters became more threatening. They were relentless, hammering away at Mary Gillespie's reputation, her marriage, even her children. What terrified her most wasn't just the accusations, it was the level of detail. The writer knew what roads she drove on her bus route, which houses she stopped at, even the errands she ran on weekends. Whoever it was, this wasn't some distant crank with a grudge. This was someone close, someone in Circleville, watching. By the summer of 1977, Mary and her husband Ron had been dealing with these anonymous notes for over a year. Then came August. One evening, Ron received a phone call at home. Family members later recalled the conversation was short, but whatever was said on the other end infuriated him. Many believe it was the letter writer taunting him directly. Ron slammed down the phone, grabbed his pistol, and stormed out of the house. Moments later, just down the road, Ron's pickup truck veered off and smashed into a tree. He was killed instantly. Investigators at first treated it like a tragic accident. The official report claimed Ron had been drinking heavily, though his family insisted he wasn't a heavy drinker. And then there was the detail no one could explain: the gun he carried had been fired once. A shot had been taken. But no bullet was recovered, no explanation offered. Had Ron pulled the trigger himself? Did someone fire at him? Or, as some theorize, had the letter writer orchestrated a trap to lure him out of the house and silence him? His death only deepened the mystery, because soon after, the letters returned, nastier than before. The town of Circleville began to feel hunted. No one knew who they could trust. Dozens of people received letters, accusing them of theft, adultery, corruption. Some were told to leave town, others were warned their secrets would be exposed. The writer wasn't just targeting Mary anymore, the entire community was under siege. For Mary, things became unbearable. In 1983, she was driving her bus route when she noticed a crude sign posted along the roadside. Once again, it mentioned her by name, mocking and threatening her. Furious, Mary pulled the sign down. But as she did, she saw something chilling behind it, a box rigged with a gun. Someone had built a booby trap designed to fire at whoever tried to remove the sign. The only reason Mary wasn't killed is because the mechanism jammed. When police examined the weapon, they traced it back to a man named Paul Freshour. Paul wasn't a stranger, he was Mary's former brother-in-law, and his marriage had collapsed bitterly a few years earlier. Investigators decided they had their culprit. In 1984, Paul was put on trial for attempted murder. Despite little physical evidence tying him directly to the trap, besides claims the gun had once been his, the jury convicted him. Paul was sentenced to 10 years in prison. For a while, it seemed the nightmare was over. But then, something bizarre happened. The letters didn't stop. They kept coming, in the same style, with the same blocky handwriting. They even showed up while Paul was behind bars. One was even sent to Paul himself inside prison, mocking him. He swore to anyone who would listen that he wasn't the writer, and that someone was framing him. The contradictions piled up. If Paul really was the Circleville letter writer, how could the letters continue while he was incarcerated? If he wasn't the writer, then why did the booby trap gun trace back to him? Some investigators quietly wondered if more than one person had been involved, or if Paul had simply been an easy scapegoat. After nearly a decade, Paul was paroled in the mid-1990s. But even then, the letters trickled on for a time before finally stopping. By then, the damage was done. Circleville had been living in paranoia for almost 2 decades. Relationships had collapsed, reputations destroyed, and in the case of Ron Gillespie, a man had lost his life under mysterious circumstances. To this day, No one knows who the Circleville letter writer really was. Handwriting experts, investigators, and journalists have all tried to solve it, but the case remains unsolved. Some believe it was Paul. Others insist he was framed, possibly by multiple conspirators who wanted Mary ruined. A few even suggest the truth lies buried in the tangled family feuds and grudges of that small Ohio town. What makes the story so chilling isn't just the unsolved crime. It's the intimacy. The letters were written by someone who knew their victims better than anyone should. They weren't random threats, they were personal, invasive, and relentless. Whoever the Circleville letter writer was, they managed to terrorize an entire community without ever being caught. And that final, lingering question still haunts Circleville: was the real author living quietly among them all along? Even after Ron's sudden death, the letters didn't stop. In fact, they multiplied. Dozens of townspeople began receiving them. Teachers, shopkeepers, even elected officials opened their mailboxes to find the same blocky handwriting, the same cruel accusations. It was as if the entire town was being stalked by an invisible hand. And then, the threats became even more public. Handwritten signs started popping up along Mary Gillespie's school bus route. Some were nailed to telephone poles, others staked into the ground. Each one accused Mary of unspeakable things, affairs, lies, even crimes. They weren't just meant for her anymore. They were placed where anyone could see them: her passengers, her neighbors, the children she drove every day. For Mary, this was the breaking point. In February 1983, she was driving her regular route when she spotted one of the signs. But this time, it wasn't just about her. It mentioned her daughter by name. Furious, she stopped the bus, walked up to the sign, and tried to rip it down. That's when she noticed something strange. The cardboard was attached to a small box, hidden behind the post. Inside was a .25 caliber handgun, rigged to fire the moment the sign was yanked. Someone had built a booby trap, and Mary had almost set it off. Police rushed to investigate. The gun was traced back to one man, Paul Freshour. He was Mary's former brother-in-law. Paul had been married to Mary's sister, but their marriage had ended bitterly. To investigators, this looked like more than coincidence. Paul insisted he had nothing to do with it. He admitted the gun had once been his but claimed it had been stolen from his garage. He also swore he had never written a single letter. Still, authorities were convinced. In 1984, Paul Freshour was put on trial for attempted murder. The prosecution had no handwriting proof. They didn't have fingerprints on the letters. What they did have was the booby trap and the fact that the weapon tied back to him. That was enough. The jury found him guilty, and Paul was sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. The people of Circleville breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, after nearly a decade of terror, it seemed like the nightmare was over. But it wasn't. Even while Paul sat in prison, the letters continued. They arrived in the same blocky handwriting, mailed from the same area, taunting not just townspeople, but Paul himself. One even made its way into the prison, addressed directly to him. In it, the writer mocked his conviction, saying justice had been served on the wrong man. This made the case even stranger. If Paul was behind bars, how could the letters keep coming? Some officials dismissed them as hoaxes or claimed Paul had somehow smuggled them out. But handwriting experts argued the new letters were consistent with the originals. Paul never wavered. Until his death in 2012, he maintained his innocence, claiming he had been framed, possibly by someone who knew about his failed marriage and wanted revenge. The letters finally stopped in the mid-1990s, but the damage was done. Over nearly 2 decades, the Circleville writer had destroyed reputations, ended marriages, and possibly caused a man's death. And despite all the investigations, no one has ever been able to prove who was truly behind it all. To this day, Circleville remains haunted by one question: was Paul Freshour the mastermind, or was the real writer someone else, still hiding in plain? Paul Freshour's conviction should have ended everything. The town expected that once he was locked away, the letters would stop. No more accusations, no more secrets spilled into mailboxes, no more fear every time a resident opened their door to find another white envelope. But within weeks of his imprisonment, that expectation was shattered. Letters continued to arrive. They were just as venomous as before, written in the same jagged block handwriting that everyone in Circleville had come to dread. They accused residents of new scandals, called out officials for incompetence, and even mocked the police for putting away the wrong man. The strangest part was the postmarks. Some of the envelopes were stamped from Columbus, as before. Others came from towns farther away, even hundreds of miles beyond Ohio. For Paul, sitting inside his cell in a controlled environment, this should have been impossible. Prison officials inspected his mail, his visitors, his belongings. They insisted he could not be sending anything out. And yet the letters kept coming, consistent in tone and style, as if the same hand was guiding the pen. The townspeople were left in disbelief. If Paul wasn't the writer, then who was? Was there an accomplice on the outside, working with him to keep the campaign alive? Or had the authorities arrested the wrong man entirely, leaving the real writer free to continue tormenting Circleville? Even Paul himself received one of the letters while in prison. It was addressed directly to him. The writer mocked him for being behind bars, suggesting justice had been served on the wrong person. This detail chilled many residents. If Paul wasn't the author, then the real writer was brazen enough to taunt him along with everyone else. Investigators tried to analyze the new letters. Handwriting experts studied them against Paul's known writing samples. The results were inconclusive. Some examiners pointed to similarities, while others insisted the style did not. The lack of fingerprints, DNA, or any other physical evidence left the case stagnant. Meanwhile, the town was still living in fear. Teachers, politicians, and business owners continued to find their lives dissected in anonymous notes. Reputations were destroyed. Marriages collapsed. No one knew who they could trust, and paranoia spread through the community. It seemed as though the writer knew everything: who was fighting, who was cheating, who was hiding secrets. Some residents even suspected the culprit might be someone inside law enforcement, with access to details no ordinary person could know. Paul never stopped proclaiming his innocence. In interviews, he explained that the gun used in the booby trap had been stolen from his garage months before it was found on the signpost. He insisted he had never built any device, never written any threatening letter, and that he was nothing more than a scapegoat. He believed that the real writer had cleverly planted evidence to frame him, taking advantage of his bitter divorce from Mary's sister to create a motive that investigators would seize on. For years, Paul sat behind bars, watching the case unfold from a distance. Every time a new letter surfaced, his claims of innocence seemed more plausible. Still, the authorities held their ground. Some argued that he had somehow found a way to keep the letters flowing, smuggling them through accomplices or manipulating the system. Others quietly admitted that maybe they had rushed to judgment, desperate to put an end to the nightmare. The letters finally stopped in the mid-1990s, nearly 2 decades after they first appeared. No one knew why. Had the writer grown tired of the game? Had they died? Or had the looming suspicion finally forced them into silence? Paul was eventually released on parole. For the rest of his life, he maintained that he had been wrongfully convicted. In 2012, he passed away, never wavering from his claim that he was innocent. To this day, the Circleville letters remain unsolved. Were they the work of a single obsessed writer who managed to torment a community for nearly 20 years, or the product of multiple people with grudges and inside knowledge? Was Paul Freshour a guilty man who found ways to keep writing from prison, or was he the victim of a carefully orchestrated frame job? The truth may never be known. What is certain is that the Circleville writer left behind one of the most chilling and bizarre mysteries in American true crime history. A case where a simple letter could ruin a life, and where the power of words alone held an entire town hostage. Paul Freshour lived the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion. Even after his release from prison, people in Circleville couldn't decide whether he was a criminal mastermind who had fooled everyone, or just an unlucky man framed by the real letter writer. Paul himself never stopped fighting back. He maintained a personal website where he published every detail he could about the case, pleading for someone to look deeper. His message was always the same: I didn't do this. But the damage had already been done. His marriage collapsed. His reputation was destroyed. And in Circleville, the whispers never went away. Every time a new letter arrived, residents couldn't help but glance at Paul's name, even if he was hundreds of miles away at the time. That's what makes this case so unsettling. On paper, the conviction made sense: the gun was his. The trap was real. He had ties to Mary. But reality was far messier. The letters after his imprisonment threw the entire theory into chaos. And the more people dug, the stranger it got. Some handwriting experts said the letters matched Paul's writing. Others disagreed, pointing out inconsistencies. To this day, the forensic evidence remains hotly debated. What we're left with is a trail of possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. One theory suggests the letter writer was actually several people, maybe a group of residents with grudges against Mary and others in town. That would explain the writer's encyclopedic knowledge of so many personal details. It wasn't one set of eyes watching Circleville. It was many. Another possibility is even darker: that the real writer intentionally framed Paul, planting his gun at the booby trap to send investigators straight to him. If that's true, then not only was this person cunning enough to avoid being caught for nearly 2 decades, but they were bold enough to taunt the police while doing it. And then there's the chilling chance that the true author might have been someone nobody ever suspected at all. Maybe someone close to the investigation. Maybe someone whose name never appeared in the newspapers. The scariest part: whoever it was, they thrived on control. The letters weren't just threats, they were psychological warfare. They exposed affairs, stirred up jealousy, turned neighbors against each other, and shattered families. And the writer did it all without ever firing a bullet. Just pen and paper. Even now, decades later, Circleville hasn't healed completely. For longtime residents, the memory of those letters still lingers. Imagine living in a town where any secret could be dragged out and nailed to a telephone pole. Imagine knowing that someone nearby was watching, listening, waiting. The Circleville letters are a reminder of something profoundly unsettling. Sometimes, the most dangerous predator doesn't come after you with a weapon. Sometimes, they use your own life, your own secrets, and your own fear as the blade. And the fact that no one has ever been unmasked makes it even worse. Somewhere out there, whether alive or long gone, the Circleville letter writer knows the truth. They know what they did. And they got away with it.
That was another real bedtime story from Wicked Nightmares Horror Stories. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.